Hey, everybody. Welcome back to the show. In case you forgot, you're on Dimension Fold, dimensionfold.com, and the YouTubes and the podcasts. And today we have Joey Madia, who is one of my favorite guests. So
Thank
I'm
you.
really excited. This is going to be fun. And Joey just released a brand new book that actually just hit the market. Was it today or yesterday?
It was late last night, so today was the
Yeah.
first full day.
Yes.
Yeah.
Awesome. Um, and yeah, already hitting the best selling new releases charts. So that's awesome. Congratulations.
Thank you. And as publisher, congratulations to you too. And we
Well,
probably
thank you.
should tell folks it's called Every Day is a Story All Its Own, a triadic approach to storytelling. And yeah, it all happened pretty quickly, right? Um, we
Yeah.
can talk about later, like if there are writers out there and talking about, I spend so much time talking to writers about, do you self-publish? Do you go with a publisher? Price points, right? Amazon just, it costs more for authors and publishers to get their work out there. So yeah, it's an
Yes.
interesting journey. But yeah, we're off to a strong start with it, which is cool.
Yeah. It's cool. I definitely would be into talking about that. So let's circle back onto that. First of all, I want to ask you. I was really like, I don't know what the word is, peaked, I guess, as the subtitle. And so the triadic approach. So what is it again?
A
What's it?
triadic approach to storytelling.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
What does that
So
mean?
so yeah, it
What
it
does it
it built
mean,
it
man?
built over time, right? A triad being a fancy word for a trio or three. And I got really fascinating with that. I have a hard time making up my mind. So, as you know, and many people know, I do many things because I don't know how not to.
Yeah.
But they all seem to start to come from storytelling. So, when I was very young, I knew that I wanted to act, but I also knew that I wanted to write. So, I carefully sort of crafted my journey as best I could as a young person to get a double degree in English literature and acting, and did it in 4 years. And so I was working as a writer, I was working as an actor, and they were like these independent lives. And I had two agents, one in Philadelphia, one in New York. I was slowly getting stuff published, but I felt like, man, I could do better. There's more out there that, I can learn more. And then it really clicked when I got my first directing gig, when I got my first theater directing gig. And I said, wow, this is cool to be a director because I understand actors and I understand writing. And I turned out to be a really good director. And then I went, okay, I need to understand about the interrelationships with these three. So that was the first triad: acting, directing, writing. Then, so that was, I got out of school 1990. And I was pretty lucky. I was working professionally almost immediately. Of I got a ton of practical experience in school. And I know your kids are into theater and all. So when it was time for me to go to school, everybody was like, oh, you've been in All Shore this and All State this, and you won these awards, but you really need to get your BFA and, Bachelor's in Fine Arts. And I said, I don't want to be guard number one for 4 years while all the master's students like play all the lead roles.
Right.
Like, it's one thing to read books. It's another thing to go out there and test theories. That's what I wanted to do. So I did all these plays. So everything was going good, but that really clicked for me. Then about 12 years later, I really got into my spiritual journey: meditation, transcendental meditation, drum journeying, astral traveling. That was like the real, sexy stuff. And as I started to look at spirituality, I bumped into through the craziest thing. I was in a dollar store, and I love Tim Allen, right? Like Home Improvement and his
Yeah.
stand-up comedy. And he had written this book called I'm Not Really Here, which was about quantum physics. And I was like, how totally ridiculous that like Tim Allen, the tool man, wrote this book about quantum physics. And I was hooked, dude. I was so hooked into the ideas of quantum physics and Heisenberg uncertainty and Schrodinger's cat. And if you observe it, you change it, all these things. It was like mind blowing. So I started to read everybody Tim Allen read. So I was reading, I don't know, Michael Zukov, right? Dance of the Wooly Masters. And
Right.
I was reading Brief History of Time, Hawking. And I was reading Michael Talbot, Physics and the New Mystics. And I was like, oh, wait a minute. I have a literary and website called New Mystics. Like, this is cool. What is this about? Then I stumbled on Fritjof Capra's Tao of Physics. I was like, holy crap. Like, this is the nexus between religion, being like a lapsed Catholic, but still, very into like, what is religion and what are the mechanisms? And, as a storyteller, religion is very much theater. Is very much
Yeah.
enactment, ritual, all of this. Rehearsal, audience, presenters, costumes. So that became the second part of the triad. And then the quantum physics, I said, well, what if I took spirituality and applied it to theater principles? So I started to reread all of the old theater books, and especially Konstantin Stanislavski, the Russian master, was talking about like, we have an antenna, and Anton Chekhov, the playwright, was saying our energy affects the audience in the moment, and then it's a feedback loop, and they actually change the performance of the actor. I was getting good enough at my craft where I was like, yeah, I understand that. I've been there. Like, if you're wide open, same way like when you go on a paranormal investigation or to mediate for a client or something, you have to guard yourself, and you have to know your crap, and you have to be prepared, but you have to be open to receive, or else nothing's going to come in. So I'm thinking about energy and performance and blah, blah, blah. And then the science came in. I started to read about neuroplasticity, mirror neurons, all of that kind of thing. Embarrassingly, looking back on it, for a lot of reasons, what the bleep do we know? Which, a lot of came out about that afterwards. But at the time, I was so turned on. It was like the mid 90s. So that's really the triad: the art and craft of classic storytelling, married with spirituality, married with primarily neuroscience, quantum physics, and psychology. And out of that really came the idea, and Brene Brown said it really well, probably a decade ago, like, telling your story is the bravest thing you can do. Like, showing up and being authentic. You're an authentic dude. Like, there aren't all these layers to unpeel, and Ken is Ken, and it's cool, and you show up and you're authentic. And at 55 years old, man, that is like my primary thing that turns me on about people. Like, if you're authentic, I don't care what you are, I don't care what your beliefs are, but if you're unique and it's coming, so that's a long-winded for a subtitle. but that's really what it is to I'll shut up there and let you.
Okay, no, that's great. I mean, okay, so you mentioned a couple of things that I want to jump on.
Yeah.
That there's this idea of the okay, so like the writer has a story in his head.
Yeah.
The director reads the script, and it's a story in his head. Is it the same story? Well, it's there's definitely strong similarities, but there's also differences between the way those two people see the thing. Then the director now gets the cast, and each of those cast members has a slightly different version as well. And then it goes out to the audience, and each person in the audience is receiving it through whatever filter they have. So I find this very fascinating that, so not only, and yeah, you're right. Also, there's the feedback loop thing, but just there's this whole like trickling out into all these different nuanced perceptions of what's actually happening on the stage and how that came to be in the first place. It's quite amazing. Yeah.
It is, and I think especially for directors, because directors are the mediators between the writer and the and the actors. And it's interesting for me because I do screenwriting and I do playwriting. Playwriting, like the writer's almost a god. So it's built in your contract. You can't change certain words. You can't cut my script. Of course, you negotiate. And anytime that I've been commissioned to write a play, it's built in my contract that I have to go to some rehearsals and we have to collaborate. And that's great. I love that. Screenwriting, the writer really gets left out of the process once they've delivered the process. And I'm reading this fascinating book, Francois Truffaut, the French auteur, interviewing Alfred Hitchcock. And it's amazing to me, especially in the 60s, 70s, how quickly they would bring another writer on. So you go, oh, we hired this writer and he was just having a little trouble upping the tension. So we brought in this other dude. Like, wow, like give him a chance, like let him expand his skills. So everything is so compartmentalized and highly specialized in screenwriting. But the play is mostly, I mean, the book is mostly from my experience at theater. So yeah, the director has this mediating role. I actually think directing is one of the toughest jobs in the creative world because you're managing all these egos and you have this vision. So I wrote a whole book on how school teachers can apply the principles of a director in classroom management. So it's called Directing for the Classroom. But you have to be a negotiator, you have to be a communicator, you have to be a visionary. So you have to be hyper creative, but then you need to leave space for your team. And we see this a little in sports with a head coach, but the head coach isn't as invested in the vision. Yeah, they come up with the game plan, they decide the defensive, offensive spread, come up with a lot of the plays and all, but the director is there. And when something flops, the interesting thing in theater or in theater is it's oftentimes the writer. So if the play doesn't succeed, oh, it's a crap script, blah blah blah. In screenwriting, because the director gets left behind in cinema, it's often the director, right? The director just didn't.
Right.
So it's very interesting to watch directors. That's how I spend my time. And I hope with the book that I get a lot of opportunities to train directors. So if there are directors out there listening, and you want some training, you want to up your game, that's what I love to do. And there's a great quote from Peter Brook, who wrote a book called The Empty Space. And Peter Brook was the artistic director for the Royal Shakespeare Company. And he was a real out-of-the-box thinker. You ever see Marat Sade, the movie with Patrick McGowan? And, oh, it's so good. It's based on a play. But basically, the Marquis de Sade stages the murder of Marat during the French Revolution in an insane asylum.
Okay.
Yeah, and based somewhat on fact. Oh, it's brilliant. And Peter Brook was amazing. But he said that a director is a guide to a place he's never been. And man, that's parenting, dude. That's always everything. Being a project lead at work, you've never been there. You're a pioneer. You're breaking new ground, but you're ultimately responsible. So you have to get all these people to come with you. And this great artistic director I work with, I remember complaining to her. I was like, "Oh, I'm trying to get my theater company started here in this new state, and I can't get everybody rowing in the same direction." And she said, "Joey, you got to get them in the boat first." And that's what the director has to do. There has to be, so to be topical, right? Chris Nolan at this point is really good at getting people in the boat. And then he becomes like Shackleton, like, no, we have plenty of seals. And they're like, no, dude, like, I'm reading Endurance right now. And they're like, dude, let's like kill some more seals. And Shackleton's like, do you not trust me? Do you not think this is enough, seal meat? That's getting people in the boat. Like literally, it's very interesting. So then, yes, the audience and that feedback loop. And I love improvisation. I try to put improvisation in everything that I do because I really love the rush of the unpredictability. So I did like classic improv for years, where it was like in a wine tasting place in a winery, and people are getting drunk. And when people are drunk at a comedy improv show, you don't know what the hell is going to happen. And that's not for the faint-hearted, right? Talk about authenticity. So yeah, so when the audience brings that, and the spiritual and the neurological, I needed to know, like, what are the mechanisms behind it? Why does this happen?
Yeah.
Why,
You,
how does energy align? So
you go into a lot of stuff that I I haven't really seen applied to theater before.
mhm.
Not that certainly not that I'm an expert on theater, but um, like you're bringing in like Gurdjieff and like all this other stuff. Like, okay, I gotta say, your bibliography is what, like 10 or 15 pages of
Yeah,
like all this really deep, crazy philosophical, like just like it's nuts. Like that's practically a history degree right there. Um, like it's quite remarkable to me, and I think honestly, that's one of the reasons why I'm able to recommend your book to a lot of my friends, because like not everybody is a professional or even aspiring theater um, career person, but there's a ton of stuff in your book that is so applicable because it's just bringing all of this other really fascinating material into the concept, and then tying it together with something that we all I think know and love, and that is storytelling itself, which is really kind of the deep roots of theater. So yeah, I don't know, maybe do you have any comments on that?
yeah. I mean, I'm a big toolbox guy. So some people wear a tool belt. Some people carry around a tray of tools. Some people have a two-tier toolbox. I'm the guy who brings in like the NASCAR like big rolling toolbox because I want to be as good as I could be. That's part of it, but it's not so much ego. It's when it comes right down to it, religions, governments, the military, corporations, they are experts at story, man. Like advertising was invented by the nephew of Sigmund Freud, Albert Bernays, right? So
Mm,
it's always been this game of warping the story, getting into the mind, but when you get into the science, it's very cool. So, people love to watch animal videos, and they also like to watch babies. And like, if you put a baby monkey in a video, like the people become millionaires, right? The
yeah.
reason is, the reason is that when we see a little helpless something in distress, so St. Jude's Children's Hospital, right? Those commercials make everybody cry
Yeah.
because this is a kid whose life was stolen from them. And the parents are falling to pieces because this is their kid and we're parents. So we get flooded with cortisol. So we can't click off that advertisement because we're going to be flooded with cortisol and we're going to be miserable for the day. We give us a happy ending. Like St. Jude's, give us a happy ending. And if the kid's in the commercial, it's because there's a happy ending. Then we get flooded with oxytocin, and that is storytelling. That's really important, I think, to tell serious storytellers or anybody. This is how the dramatic arc works. We flood the audience with cortisol in act one because we set up a problem. Then, as we're rooting for the hero, we're really getting involved. We're yelling at the television, don't do this, don't do that. And then we're rooting for him. And then by the third act, it might as well be us. And when they have a victory, it's our victory. And that's sports. That is all this tribal communal. With Gurdjieff, it's interesting because it is triads and it's the relationship between work and living this full energetic spiritual life. I had another really good example for you and it went out of my head. I was like, clear. So, oh, yes. Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Every actor, we talk about motivation, we talk about an actor's spine. Um, if the basic needs are not met, forget about like appreciating art or going for a hike and communing with nature. You just have to figure out how you're going to feed your family. That's really important for an actor to know because that's stakes, right? But
Hmm.
then you can recommend the book, and I'm so glad that you are because we all have to tell our story. And if all these different pillars of society, all these control mechanisms and gatekeepers are expert storytellers, if they literally hire Hollywood people to come in and make campaign videos or to spin this or do that, then if we're going to compete in the world, like literally compete, we have to be really good at telling our story. So these are the tools we need. Because if someone's not feeding themselves or their family, they don't have shelter, they don't have enough companionship, all that kind of stuff, they're going to be really angry. They're just going to be cortisoled out with no oxytocin in sight. So they're going to act out in crazy ways. So that's what really turns me on about pulling all this stuff.
So you're saying that you're going to build elements of the plot in that are going to connect with those different levels on Maslow's hierarchy in the correct order.
Yeah, well, at least the lower and the higher. So there's only two kinds of stories basically that you can tell. And it's kind of funny because they've been studying story. Aristotle was the first one who went, a story should really have a beginning, middle, end, if it's a good story.
Yeah.
So that was wild. That was Aristotle came up with that. And then like in the 1700s, it was like, oh, there's 120 something different stories. Then it was like 86. Then it jumped to like 20. But there's really two. There's Boy Meets Girl and there's Stranger in a Strange Land. But the funny thing is that anybody who's ever been in love knows that Boy Meets Girl is Stranger in a Strange Land. Especially, especially for us, young love, whatever, when you forget it, you're knocked on your heels. You're filled with, it's weird. Your oxytocin and your cortisol are going nuts. And you're trying to meet these needs, these tribal needs of getting together, pairing, starting a family, all of these base drives. So I do a lot of work with the chakras too, because they align very well with the creative process, right? The seed idea all the way up to actually. So so I think a really good writer understands human psychology, understands that in order to really own the victory vicariously, the stakes have to be high and there have to be defeats. And yeah, these things have to be gathered. Think about video games. You go around basically taking care of your basic needs before you go out and get a fancy suit of armor and a magic flaming sword. I'm wearing my old school Dungeon Master. I began storytelling when I was 12 and playing D&D and writing my own Dungeons and Dragons adventures. So it's everywhere. I think that all of this stuff is everywhere. And Gurdjieff's stuff I learned pretty early on, and it opened up all these interesting things that these mystics were talking about that were super practical.
Right. Even though it seems, that whole realm can seem really not practical, but it actually is. Yeah, that's interesting. So, okay. What happens? So you're talking about, I'll use the word manipulating.
Yeah, it is manipulation.
It has negative connotations, but it doesn't have to be. So as a writer it's not just the writing, it's the stage setup, the whole presentation, all that stuff. So the cast and crew and production and writer and everybody are manipulating the audience's emotions or at a more basic level, chemicals. So and you talked about like the first act and the second, that's really cool. And you've got like this really self-contained sort of 2-hour unit. Okay.
Yep.
We'll give them a 10-minute break just to get their breath, and then we're back at them. How does that work? Or maybe this is why it doesn't work. When you now have there's this real shift to the 10-hour or the 12-hour episodic, the Netflix thing. I can't tell a story in 10 hours. I want a story told to me in an hour or 2 hours, but now it's like, as a viewer, I'm having a hard time with this because, okay, first episode, it better grab me, otherwise I'm gone. Um, but then there's this I have this expectation that I'm supposed to feel something.
Mhm.
How does the writer or the director or everybody involved in producing this, um, is it must be a lot harder to do in this episodic kind of a thing.
Well, it is. That's a really, really great question. I just want to circle back real quick to say the manipulation by the director and the actors and the crew and all of that all hinges on that old maxim, the willing suspension of disbelief.
Yeah,
So an audience is saying, please manipulate me.
right.
Take me away from my troubles, teach me something new, make me break out in a sweat, help me get laid tonight. I hope I could say that on your show.
Yeah, of
You know
course.
what I mean? When you go to a rom-com, you know what I mean?
Yeah,
Or a horror movie where she's coming up with something like, please give me a jump scare, like help
right,
me out here. So that
right.
really hinges, it's an agreement. Otherwise, it's propaganda. It's agitprop if you don't agree to it. Misinformation, disinformation. So I just want to say that. Okay, so this is all really exciting because I just read this is why the bibliography is 15 pages. I read like 12 books at a time. But I just finished a really good biography of Rod Serling. And the cool part was nested within that was the dawn of television because he really came in from radio into television,
Oh
what
yeah,
CBS Playhouse and all that. And they were trying to figure it out. And when they first came to guys like Rod Serling and Richard Matheson and all these great guys who were writing for television, Fahrenheit 451.
oh yeah.
Yeah, Ray
Bradbury.
Bradbury writing for television. All these brilliant, brilliant writers, right? I love these guys. They said, okay, well, we need commercial breaks. And they're like, whoa, wait a minute. Okay, we got to go into the laboratory. We have to figure this out. Now, here's how it works. I love long form drama, and the problem was solved by binging, by dumping something. I
Yeah,
still really now have a hard time with HBO and some of these other guys that still drop an episode a week. But we have all these podcasts and all that have come in to create bridges to keep people talking. So in the old days of television, back in the 90s when I was in corporate and publishing, it was water cooler talk. So you wanted to
yeah.
hit them with something
Right,
that they would be talking about on Monday morning, right?
right.
So how this works, and again, how science is really helpful, it's holograms and fractals. Every beat in a scene, every little bit encapsulates the scene. The scene encapsulates, well, I have it the other way around. The series encapsulates the episode. That episode it goes backwards. It's like
Right.
nesting. It's like matryoshka eggs, right? So that's what you have to be aware of. And the problem is there's all this pushback on the 3-act model. There's all this pushback on the hero's journey. But you know what? Story is mathematical, just like music is. Like you can experiment like John Cage, right, with music and be very cacophonous and do different things. It's not music. I don't know that he necessarily said it was an experiment in sound and all this, and then Philip Glass kind of brings you closer, and then you get into different things. So it works. Jaws is classic 3-act model.
Hmm.
They get in the damn boat. That's separation. They all have different reasons for being in the boat. All the reasons are very different. That creates a lot of conflict. So in conflict, you have man versus man versus nature, man versus society. I also think there's a fourth one, man versus self. We don't get to explore that much. I suppose in a survival movie, Castaway is man. It's man versus nature, but it's really man versus self. Like, do you have the balls to
Well,
knock
what about
your tooth out?
what about like the psychological thriller? Well, like I'm thinking, what
Yeah,
about like Moon or Fight Club? Right. I mean, an extreme
yeah,
example because it's
yeah.
man versus
A great
himself, but
one.
is it
Yeah,
himself even? Like, yeah, like so. There's a lot you can do to mess around with these things, but there's
right,
still the simple idea.
right. So as all those things are happening, you're building in all of those things. So I always try. I have a pirate series that I'm writing, Cannon and the Quill. And I think it's going to be like 8 books. The very first scene is basically the entire story, is
Mm.
in the very first scene. Um, we don't always have to do that, but in screenwriting, there's a wonderful analytical process by a guy named Blake Snyder, and it's called Save the Cat.
Yeah, yeah.
And I have probably looked at 30, 40, because I also work as a story analyst and a script doctor. So movies that are already made, already out there, and movies that I'm helping people develop and make better. I always use Blake Snyder's The Cat. Well, the opening image and the closing image reflect each other, but
Right.
they're slightly different because you know what the arc is.
Yes.
So begin with the end in mind. That's really how you do long form.
Right. Yeah, you need to have that parallelism.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
I'm
I
big on
think,
parallelism and symmetry.
yeah,
Yep.
yeah, symmetry for sure. Nice. Okay. What's my next question? I don't know. What's your next answer, Joey?
My next, I don't know. I'm glad that you're recommending it to people who aren't in the field. People in the field are going to find their way to it, right? It was number
Yeah,
2 released in playwriting,
yeah,
so they're going to automatically go to it. But I think they'll learn. Here's something I would like to say, and maybe this will. Audiences are way more sophisticated than they used to be.
yeah.
And so we have all this, the Nolans and Stephen Moffat and Mark Gatiss, and they play with time, right? Doctor Who and Chris Nolan stuff can be so complicated. But audiences have learned to do it. There was a really cool German language show on called Dark.
Yes.
Did you see it?
Awesome.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And you had to almost be like pen and paper if you wanted to. Now, I ultimately gave up on Dark, and I'll tell you why, without giving anything away. But if you saw it, it's almost like the red thread on a conspiracy board.
Yeah.
So I started to get the impression that the writers, and Chris Nolan is a little guilty of this. His brother Jonathan is definitely guilty of it. J.J. Abrams, very guilty. I'm going to try to trick the audience. The game is to not have them figure it out.
Right.
And once you started learning the interrelationships in Dark, it was like, oh, this is an exercise this is like Needless Things from Stephen King on steroids. Like, how can I take a closed system of people and interconnect them in amazing ways? It got kind of absurd, but it was cool. And I don't think an audience 15 years ago could watch that. And I'm a little disappointed that on the back end of the strikes, they're saying that the golden age of television, the second one, is over. They're putting the money back into movies.
It's easy to say.
Yeah, we'll see what happens.
But I mean, there's a lot of, there's a lot of crap coming out,
Yeah,
but there's
there is.
also a lot of really cool stuff.
Mhm.
So I think the main thing is that if you've got an idea, you've got to do your idea, and if you read Joey's book, you'll know how to do your idea well. And that's the thing is like I hang around with a lot of authors, so and when I started writing, the first book I wrote was a sci-fi novel, so a lot of my writer friends are sci-fi novelists, and they're most of them are doing some really great stuff, but then there's people who just are like, I'm just going to start writing, and it's like they don't even have an idea of what. There's no outline. There's no, there's no beginning with the end in mind, and in my opinion, it makes for poor quality material. Not saying that all of it is garbage, but if you actually studied the structure of what you're trying to build, you can build something better than even if it's pretty cool stuff that you're able to make. I'm just saying you could do it, you could make it even better if you examine the structure. You wouldn't build a house without looking at a blueprint.
That's
and
right.
yet here we are. So I think that's part of the problem. Um, I mean, I don't want to bitch too much about it, but if let's look at the TV show Lost.
Hmm.
Like, they had no fucking clue where the show was going. Like, first season was okay, they're building something cool, and then it just started to fall apart. And by the end of it, it made no sense whatsoever. Like, the finale was complete garbage.
I
Um,
agree.
and so now parallel that with Game of Thrones. Excellent series, until they got to the part where they ran out of material because the author stopped writing the books, and now they're trying to produce a show that has no script, and you can tell it
Yeah.
just fell apart.
Mhm.
Um, so yeah, I mean, I think it's really important to plan where you're going.
Can
Um,
I?
yeah, go ahead.
Sorry. No, can I'm going to offer my 2 cents about what went wrong with both those shows, why
Hmm.
they were so great, and why they ultimately failed. It's all about people. It's all about the characters. That's what we show up for every week. We all talk about the high concept. And man, Lost had a high concept. And even, this geopolitical strategizing in Game of Thrones, that was a high concept too. But we were most interested in the characters. And when they got away from the characters and really started to invest too much in the high concept, that's where they fell apart. I reference a really good article about Lost in the book in Every Day is a Story. Um, and basically, it was because they invested in the characters. They also, another thing though, Ken, that they had going against them was season 5, I believe, was the truncated the writer's strike, where they
Mm,
brought in the scabs, and that's where they did all the parallel life stuff. I agree with you. I hate the finale. But that show is a really good example over 6 years, I believe, where we start with Jack's eye and we end with Jack's eye. So
yeah,
that's
okay.
very much Save the Cat.
They did a couple things right.
Oh, they did. They
Yeah,
did. And J.J. Abrams group, Lindelof, um, but anytime, like, and I don't want to alienate anybody here. Everything is so subjective. I really don't like Cabin in the Woods. Uh, and I think the reason I don't like Cabin in the Woods is because it's all high concept.
yeah,
It's all high concept, and I don't care about the characters. The
right.
characters are tropes. So it's
Well,
this,
that's because they're
yeah,
horror characters. They're
yeah,
throwaway, right?
right. But they don't present, somehow to me, it doesn't present as a straight horror film. It still has that J.J. Abrams mystery box cleverness
Yeah,
to it.
no, you're right. You're right.
Yeah,
Um,
and you know who does that extraordinarily well? Jordan Peele. I mean, I love Jordan Peele's movies. He can somehow do really high concept in horror and still have characters that, oh man, they're great.
Sorry, I can't recall which films are we talking about
Oh,
here.
Jordan Peele is Nope,
Oh yeah,
and Us, and then the first one, geez, I forget the name of the first
yeah, I
one,
know what you're talking about. Okay,
where the
yeah,
rabbit comes and kidnaps the dude in the opening frame, and you're like, the what now? So so I do think that he does do high concept very well, and I think that's where David Lindelof. But I like The Leftovers. That was Lindelof, and because the characters, you cared about the characters. Like, oh my god, that
yeah,
that was all about survivor guilt, and we've all
yeah,
been there. So,
right. Okay, so let's get back to characters,
mhm,
character development, and Maslow's hierarchy.
okay,
How do you tie that in with that when you're writing characters?
yeah. Well, a couple of things. I have really become very fond of the idea of the gap because that's what we're all doing. Like, you and I we have families and we could be writing books. We're doing this. This somehow closes the gap between who we are and where we want to be by sharing this with people,
Mm,
from the comfort of our home and our home studios and all of that. So I'm really interested in this idea of where I am and where I want to be. If I have to eat, that is so fundamental. I'm reading a Louis L'Amour book now called Last of the Breed, and this American fighter pilot who's a Native American escapes from a Russian Siberian prison, and he has to survive. That's the only thing. He doesn't have
Mhm.
time to kiss the girl. And when he meets the cute Russian girl, I go, oh, he should like stop off and get a little nookie because like he's on the run for his life. He has no time for nookie, man. So that part of
He's
Maslow's,
like,
it
"Do you
ain't
have a
there.
potato?"
Yeah, exactly. Right. Like, I know how to hunt. I'll give you some meat. You give me this. I'll do this. And he's very pragmatic. So
Yeah.
he's constantly playing the wants. And that's how Maslow's hierarchy works. Motivation has become a really dirty word, right? Like actors. Oh, what's my motivation, man?
Yeah.
Um, what do you want? What must you have? And if you don't get it, this doesn't move forward. And it's so what we teach actors is the same thing that we kind of teach people. You have to change your strategy. So I come to you, Ken, and I say, Ken, I had this really cool um concept for a 10 book deal, right? Because I sold a
Mhm.
couple books now. So now I think you
Of
should give me a
course,
10
I'm
book
in.
deal. And you're gonna pay for it up, you're gonna pay for it up front, and it's real extravagant, and it's gonna have all these audio concept with big websites and all this kind of stuff. If you say no, I could go, well, okay, man. Well, I tried. I'll go someplace else. Or I could go, Ken, I can write a really cool part for you. And I know you've always wanted to be an actor. We're playing the wands. And
Right.
that's where only one of us can get our way, really. Compromise is not very dramatic. You
Yeah.
know, it's a little boring. Oh, either this dude, the last of the breed, is going to cross the Bering Strait and get back to America, or he's not.
Yeah.
Right? One
You know,
thing's
I,
going to happen.
I use motivation for to make it fun for myself when I'm playing D&D.
Mm,
Never mind when I'm DMing. Uh, but like if I'm playing, I'll, I mean, it's fun, but it doesn't have to be fun. It's only fun if you're engaging, right?
yeah.
And so I sometimes need a little help to make sure I'm having fun. So I'll be like, oh yeah, I think about my character's motivation. Well, like it's the what would he do, or what would she do? But it's more than that because it's why are they doing it, right?
Yes.
And to me,
Yes.
that makes it really interesting because now if I ask that question, um, I can answer that question, and it gives me not only what am I going to do in this situation, but what am I probably going to try to do tomorrow,
Hmm.
or it gives you this real projection of where your character is trying to get to, um, and also then you can that's actually really helpful to also imagine back into the past where they came from, because not all of us are really great at writing the character's backstory, and but we all know that it's cool to have, it's fun to have, and your DM's probably going to want you to have something.
Yeah.
um, and so it's kind of like, oh well, you don't necessarily have to come up with a backstory, if you look at it from the perspective of what's my motivation.
Right.
You can choose whatever motivation you want, and then look forward as to what your character would do, and that'll automatically write itself as to where they came from.
Absolutely true. There are exercises in the book, and I think they're very fun exercises for building a character and building a character backstory. So I
Mm,
love it. I need to know. I do write fantasy. My second fantasy novel came out 2 weeks ago.
sweet.
So through a weird coinky dink, I had two books come out in 2 weeks, which is really kind of weird and surreal and whatnot. But two very different kind of books, and I love that backstory. I love that history. But ironically, the kingdom in my fantasy series is only 100 years old because I've
Oh,
never seen that before. They're always really ancient. But
yeah.
yet, what's really interesting about America is it's so damn young and can be so childish. So I get this opportunity to kind of forge this kingdom and let it go through its growing pains. And one of my readers was like, "Oh, it's so light and airy and fluffy, the kingdom in the first book, and it's really the imagery is like really dark almost from the get-go." And I'm like, "Well, they went through X and now they're further up that ladder of need and they can pay attention to things that they couldn't once you're bordered right once they learned how to you're a historian. You go way back. I happen to have your books right here because you're
Ah,
gonna be
thank
on my
you.
show
Hey,
May
right
9th.
on.
So these ancient stories, but what we learn is once the hunter gatherer, once that got figured out, once agriculture came, then we could have culture. So
Yeah.
that becomes really really important. I was always, I mean, my fantasy novels began when I was 13 years old, writing D&D. Like my first fantasy novel has characters that came from those adventures. But you're absolutely right. You can go into the moment, and as long as you have plenty needs to be met now moving forward, backstory. Some people don't want to know backstory. They don't want to know. And some characters are very, very mysterious, like the man with no name, right? In the Sergio Leone westerns. I don't know a damn thing about his
Right.
backstory.
Right.
Um,
All we know
but
is his theme music.
yeah,
Yeah.
right. Yeah, and he's very fond of this, poncho and his little cigarellos, right? And he's super fond of his horse, which we can, he spends a lot of time alone, so we can figure that out. But we don't care where he came from. He's literally the man with no name. But then there's F. Paul Wilson's Repairman Jack, and when his origin stories came out, that was wild. That was terrific. Oh, he was a teenager and this thing happened and he went on this venge quest. So I think it's story specific. Sometimes the mystery is a really, really cool thing.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
I mean, well, I don't know. I guess you could say I'll generalize it, even though maybe it's not necessarily apt. But I'll say that when I write stories, I kind of like to stop before the ending and
Hmm.
leave the ending to be a mystery.
Yeah.
Um, that feels really good to me. Even as a reader, it doesn't happen very often. But when I'm reading a book that does have that, I'm like, oh yeah, they did it to me, and I love it, right? Because it's like you can see just enough so that you can imagine an ending,
Yeah.
which is probably better than any ending that was actually put on paper.
Yeah. I think that's it. Like Chris Nolan's Inception. People talked for months about which way did the
Yeah,
spin,
yeah,
the
yeah,
dreidel, the spinner, which way did it fall? And that's amazing. How about with David Chase? David Chase, I think it was David Chase in Sopranos. People went out of their minds. But
yeah.
I know what happened to Tony in my worldview, in
Right,
my
right,
zeitgeist. He did not make it out of that diner. He didn't make it out of the diner. There was no happy ending.
right.
Um,
And
but
how many Reddit
everybody can have their
conversations?
Tony.
Yeah, and how
Yeah,
many Reddit threads has that spawned? Right.
yeah,
So it takes on its own life, where it's like uh, maybe that's the best form of advertising is not finishing the story.
it some people can't handle it. Some people
Hmm.
can't handle ambiguity, and I think it's funny because you have to know why the writer is doing it. Um, if they have a really clear reason why they're doing it, and I believe David Chase and I do believe Chris Nolan had very specific reasons. If you just don't know how to end it, so you just end it and it's open ended, and let the reader
No, yeah.
figure it out. It smells of that,
Right. It
you
almost
know?
has to be where it's like it's either going to be this or this.
Yeah,
Like so you're almost writing two endings but not showing either of them.
right.
But
And you have to,
you still have to know what they are.
yeah.
Maybe.
Well,
Yeah.
I think that's what it is, right? So let's go back to or let's go to quantum physics. Uh, the collapsing of wave probabilities. That's really what we do as writers.
Right.
And that's what a series does. You go, okay, this character has to get from point. So, and it's why we can watch Apollo 13 or Titanic and know damn well the ending because they have to get from A to B. How I choose to get them from A to B, that's the whole thing. But if B is open ended, then I have to implant all those wave probabilities. They still have to be active. And that's the great thing about Tony sitting in that diner. Oh, wait a minute. That's that trucker dude from like three seasons ago. And
Yeah.
what's that little tension with the sun? And what so you have to keep those wave probabilities alive. Lost might have actually been better off if they hadn't collapsed all the wave probabilities to one building on one particular afternoon. I think that they would have been better off. So, but understanding quantum physics is a really cool way to go. Oh yeah, every decision I make closes a pathway in the
Right.
story tree.
Right. Right.
And that's what's cool. That's what makes the micro and the macro. The macro story is there and we know it, right? That's how tropes work. Like you asked me to write a blurb for a short story. I knew almost exactly where it was going, but I
Yeah.
loved getting there.
Yeah.
And that's the other thing, the big takeaway from the book. Yes, there's only two kinds of stories. Yes, there's a zillion tropes. And one of my favorite shirts says, "You say trope like it's a bad thing." I think tropes are awesome. And for an audience that doesn't know, those are just basically stereotypical elements. So a gothic trope is the castle on a stormy night and the cobwebs and the everybody looks like they got on too much eye makeup and that's that thing. But there's a familiarity there. And when we're familiar, then they can take us to unexpected places and we're like, oh, cool. This is okay.
Yeah.
This is cool. This is neat.
But also
So,
sometimes we want to see the expected places because we like
yeah,
them.
heck, we do.
Yeah.
Um, but then when you twist them a little, so I do a little bit. I'm not a big gamer, like video games, things like that.
Hmm.
Basically, I like to get on a horse in Red Dead Redemption, and I just like to ride around and then screw things up, and then ride back to that town and see what other things I can screw up. But then I get really frustrated. This happened like last Easter. I was at my son's house, and I was playing these video games I didn't want to play because I had a consulting gig and I had to learn certain things, and
Okay.
the clients were like, I love this game and I love this and I love BioShock. So I'm watching BioShock and I'm going, this is such a controlled atmosphere. And I
Yeah.
was told it wasn't. So I'm very into ludocognitive dissonance.
Yeah.
Like, I want the damn door to open. And if the
Right.
door doesn't open, reality collapses on me like it's a scene out of Inception. But I like Red Dead, but then I go back to camp and I'm so sucked into this world that the madam is talking to the dudes in the camp. And I go up to her and I want to have a conversation with her, stupid me, because they're all canned responses, right? It's choose
Right.
your own adventure from
Right.
like when I was a kid in the 70s, and it was like, do you try to avoid the bends and go right up to the water, or do you wait for a new tank to come?
Yeah.
Turn to page 16, turn to page 17. I grew up on all of that. So yeah, that kind of stuff is wild, but I'm doing all that kind of stuff, but I do like to go in VR into liminal zones. And what I love is, oh, it's a motel. It's got some classic cars out front. It's got the neon. And you go into the lobby and something's just a little out of place. And there is no story. You have to create the story because there's no characters to interact with. And you go from room to room and you start looking for the weird, creepy shit. Like, you go in the bathroom and there's like a cassette recorder, but the tape is like pulled out, and you're like, do I sit next to this toilet for the next 3 hours? And of course I can't. That's the ludocognitive dissonance, right? You can't reassemble the tape. But you're like, damn, like, why were they in the bathroom pulling out spools of tape? And so I do love that kind of thing. And I do talk a lot in the book about place. Place is so important for that
Yeah.
reason.
What
Atmosphere.
is it about places? And there's a spiritual side of place as well, right?
Absolutely, there is. And place, I was thinking about it today, and now the book is out in the world, and I don't know if I would have addressed it anyway. I tried not to get into really polarizing political stances.
Yeah.
I tried to keep the middle road. People have to figure that out. Um, but place has energy and place has memory. So we act with it and then we trade. So place gives us memories, place changes our energy. So I try to live as many places and travel as much as I can. It affects my writing so much. living in the middle of winter in Maine, or living in the middle of the summer in Arizona in the desert, or living at the shore where I've spent a lot of my life, or living in this very strange place, Eastern Ohio, that I live now, which is like no place I've ever lived before. But I've done some of the best writing of my life here, because the people are very working class, and they're simple, like in good ways. They're authentic. When I say simple, I mean authentic, not a lot of pretense. And that really kind of grows on me in my work. So there's also a mathematical formula that I have for the book in my, what I call my 3 threes of good storytelling. So as you know from the book, it's all constructed, nested threes, the book and all. Which is why the prologue is like the first like third of the book. I just call it extended prologue because I needed it for the structure. But place plus the problem or the circumstances or the what, as we call it, right? The who, the where, the what, how place and the problem work on the character affects behavior. That's the equation. So we behave different in a roller rink or at a wrestling event than we do in a library or a church under most circumstances. So place is very volume, behavior, gesture, even topic. There's certain things you don't talk about at certain places. And there's certain things that you have to talk. You know, if you're in the boys' locker room, you're inevitably going to talk about who's sleeping with who and what's going, even if you have to make it up because that's the expectation. So if you have nothing to contribute in that space, it's going to work on your behavior. You're going to be like, I'll just make some shit up, right? I'll pay her later to agree to it, right? So
well, that's the thing, is like there's a certain place that comes with it, with a certain feel, right?
absolutely,
Like
right?
even if you're in a desert, if you're standing in a desert in, say, the high desert in Northern California, or if you're standing in the Mojave Desert, they're both deserts, but they're very different and they're going to feel different.
Right on. Yeah, so there are those nuances. So there's landscape, there's temperature, there's tone, there's atmosphere, and that all comes back again to higher Maslow's needs. Um, One of the most successful things I ever did with school kids, and the blueprint of it is in the book. So there are all these appendices, folks. So you could, if you're teachers or your directors, there's a lot of stuff that you can take and run with. And please do let me know what you think of it, because I would love to hear how it worked for you. But it's 2 weeks on a desert island. So it struck me, I was working with kids in school, and when I lived in Jersey, it's one of the most affluent states, also had some of the highest suicide rates because of the pressure on the kids. So nobody gets out clean, right? That's story. Nobody gets out clean. Um, so these kids are under immense pressure, but everything's taken care of. It's temperature regulated. They know that lunch is at a certain time. Mom and dad are going to come pick them up. I go from class to class. I know what the expectations are. Well, what if these kids got on a boat and the boat was trying out some new auto nav tech? And the teacher wasn't even on it, just the kids. And the tech crapped out during a lightning storm, and they wind up on an island. So it became this really cool Lord of the Flies sort of psychological experiment in these classrooms where the teachers were like, these kids who never participate and they're troublemakers, they wound up being the leaders. And it's like, yeah, you got to learn from that. Like people will rise to who they are under those, take away those basic needs. So you're like, I'm on an island. What's the first order of business? We got to get the hell off the island. No, no, no. That's not the first order of business. You got to have safety. You got to build shelter, and you facilitate. So you stay the hell out of the way and you let them figure it out. Rod Serling said something very, very wise. The audience must come to the truth of the story on their own. Otherwise, it's dogma, right? Like I know we've been talking for a while, but I cut my teeth in writing in 2 really strange places. One was participatory theater for 3 to 7-year-olds. So how the hell do you keep a 3-year-old engaged in theater for 40 minutes? That's the hardest writing sometimes you will ever have to do. That's real problem solving, right? That's how do you meet their needs? It has to be visually and orally exciting, and you have to make them apart. And Ken, I used to go to these plays that were participatory, and it was somebody going, "Okay, kids, we're the wind. Let's make the sound of the wind." And I'm like, bullshit. That is not participatory. You're insulting these kids. So the kids were the cast immediately. An actor comes out and goes, I did Wee Willie Winky in this Mother Goose play that made me a lot of money. It's with dramatic publishing and all. But I also acted in it. There you go. Like, you understand because you do all of
Yeah.
it. And it was like, oh, brothers and sisters, you're all here. That's great. It's bedtime, but I don't want to go to bed. So let's come up with some reasons when mom comes in to like stay up late. And we play all the games in Mother Goose just to keep mom entertained so we don't have to go to bed. It's totally simple, but the kids are like, yeah, like if I do this, the play will keep going on and I don't have to go suck applesauce like in the cafeteria, right? Like, this is cooler. So we try to, I talked about those gaps. So for the character, for the audience, we want those gaps to be big. For me as a writer, I want the gaps to be small as possible. So I write a lot of historical fiction. And it's, where is that moment in history where we don't legitimately know what the hell happened in that hour, that month, that year? And that's where I write the story, right?
Mm.
Charles Vane the pirate, there was a full year between when he was hung, when he was captured, and when he was hung. Nobody knows what happened that year. Well, as a writer, I'll give you some ideas. And I built an escape room on that preface. I built a 4 novel and counting series based on that. Because you go, what could have happened? What was going on there? And I'm not going to spoil it for everybody. So yeah, try to keep those gaps as narrow as possible when you're writing.
That reminds me of in Hamilton, where there's that one number in the room.
Oh yeah.
What happened in the room, and it's like, to me, that is like the crux of the whole play, is that something happened and nobody knows what, and the characters don't know what. There's a couple of characters who were in the room, and everybody else is totally in the dark, and it changed history, and it leaves us as the audience just begging for more, right?
Yeah.
Like, oh, somebody's got to make a Hamilton 2 where it's just about that one scene, right? And you could totally do it too.
It speaks volumes. I mean, to me, Aaron Burr is the much more, like, I'm very much Team Burr. Like, I think
Okay,
Alexander Burr is why America is America. And I mean, yeah, Alexander Hamilton, I really think that Washington should have listened to Jefferson. But anyway, isn't that it? I mean, ironically, my very first so I did the children's participatory, and then I did social justice plays for high school and middle school kids about drugs, about suicide. These kids have such a well attuned and calibrated bullshit meter that you
yeah,
cannot pull over on them. You
yeah,
can't. You just have to tell it like it is. So when I had to do a play about teen pregnancy in Arizona, where all the kids are running around half naked because it's 100 degrees, woo, right? And I was like, we can't just say no. That's BS. They're not saying no. If they weren't saying no, they wouldn't be leading. I mean, if they were saying no, they wouldn't be leading the country in this stuff. So the big night, my partner disappears. I'm like sorting, you're a musician, so I'm sorting like lighting cables, and I turn around and my partner's gone. And I'm like, where the heck is? And they're like, oh, he's talking to the press in the back room. He was in the room where it happened. And I was not in the room in the biggest night of my life. And I went, well, son of a bitch, I'm going to be in the room. Like, what do you do to do that? And at one point he came to me and he said, you got to go out on your own, man. You can't ride my coattails. And I was like, of course, when you're riding somebody else's coattails, you are not in the room. Or if you are in the room, you're a coffee boy. Like, you're not really in the room. Like, you might know the story, but you're not empowered to tell it. And I think that's the big driver for Aaron Burr. Like, I want to be in that room. Like, why is this little, 4-foot little philandering little so-and-so with his weird ideas about debt and, all this kind of stuff? The originator of espionage, by the way, corporate espionage, Hamilton. That's a really good point. We all want to be in the room. And that's a major. But that's those who the all right, this is going to sound way too clever and it's late, but when you're trying to address your lower needs, you just want to be in a room, any room, especially when it's raining, especially when people are killing each other in the street. You just want to be in a room. But the room, that's when you climb up the hierarchy. So maybe it didn't sound as
No,
flippant
that's
as I was
really.
worried it wasn't gonna.
I think that's really good, and we're pretty much out of time here, but
Right on.
that's probably a good way to end it. Is that um, all of us love to consume story, or all of us love to be entertained, and of course, it's not just about entertaining, but then we go and we're stuck in our 9 to 5, and that's the bottom rung of Maslow, because
Yeah.
you got bills to pay. Um, but that's the thing, I think, with art, and that um, all of us has within us the capability to create, and a lot of us, we just don't know how. And I mean, you and I also didn't know how until we started doing it. So
Right
that's
on.
the thing, is you just got to do it, and pull yourself up to that next level, because you can either just ignore it and just do the daily grind, or you can start to engage in some of this other cooler stuff. And if you don't know how, then pick up Joey's book, because then after you read that, you will certainly not know everything, but you'll know a ton of cool ideas as to how to actually start doing something. So, yeah, I'm going to flash up your book. It's going to cover my face right here. So, here's Joey's book, and here's the link underneath. Go check that out for sure. And, Joey, thanks so much again for coming on the show. Um,
Thank you.
I look forward to talking to you again. I know I'm coming on your show in a month or something like that.
Yeah, May 9th to talk about these two amazing books and talk about the biogenetic engineering and alternate meanings to the I'm really sold. I mean, I'm really excited. And thank you from the bottom of my heart. I just have to just tell this real quick.
Okay, yeah.
5 years ago, I had an agent who was working really hard to sell the book that you just published.
Mm,
And we got to a really, really big New York publisher, and they said, as soon as one of his screenplays hits, we'll publish this book. They love the book. So that game. So publishers like you are crucial to, if the material is good, we will put it out and we will promote it. We will get in people's hands, rather than this game of they didn't want to make a single change to the book. They just wanted it written by a guy who had a hit movie.
right.
Silly. So I'm deeply appreciative to you to burst this baby into the world.
Oh, well, thanks a lot, man.
All right.
It's a pleasure to me to be able to do this for you.
Cool.
All right. Yeah. Well, we'll catch you later, and everybody tune in on the next episode, and we always have more fun stuff. All right. See you later.